For over 100 years, one question has quietly divided historians, anthropologists, and everyday families across East Asia, and it has never fully gone away. Think about how strange that actually is. Most countries settle their founding stories fairly early, wrap them in a bit of poetry, and move on. But this particular question kept resurfacing, generation after generation, in classrooms, in academic journals, in family dinner conversations, because the stakes attached to it were never just academic. They were personal. They touched on who counted as a real descendant of a civilization, whose ancestors deserved credit for one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth, and whether that culture had grown entirely on its own or had, in some sense, been handed down from somewhere else. For a question with that much emotional weight riding on it, it's remarkable how long it went completely untested. Where did the Chinese people actually come from? Not in the vague, textbook sense of ancient China had rivers and rice, but in the deeper sense, the blood sense, the ancestry sense. Was the civilization that rose along the Yellow River something that grew up entirely on its own soil, untouched by outside hands, or was it, as some scholars once insisted with total confidence, planted by travelers from a much older civilization thousands of miles away? For decades, this wasn't just a fringe-rumor. It was taught in universities. It was printed in serious academic journals. And it split families and scholars into camps that genuinely believed the other side was rewriting history for the wrong reasons. Then, over the last 20 years, something changed. Scientists finally had the tools to stop arguing and start testing. They pulled ancient bones out of caves in northern China, out of riverbanks, out of burial sites untouched for thousands of years, and they read the genetic code hidden inside them like a diary nobody was ever supposed to open. What they found didn't just answer the question that had been debated for a century. It uncovered something far stranger sitting underneath it, a second mystery that the first one had been quietly hiding all along. Before we get to what the DNA actually showed, it's worth sitting with the three big stories people told themselves for generations, because none of them came from nowhere. Each one made real sense to the people who believed it, and each one shaped how millions of people understood their own family line. And it's worth being honest about something up front. None of these three stories were dreamed up by fools. Each one was believed at some point by serious, well-educated people who were doing the best they could with the tools available to them at the time. Before genetics existed as a science, the only evidence anyone had to work with was language, pottery, old texts, and folk memory. And all three of those tools can be bent to tell almost any story you already want to believe. That's not a criticism of the people who believe these stories. It's just a reminder of how much harder it used to be to actually know rather than simply guess where people came from. The first story is the oldest, and it isn't really a scientific theory at all. It's a myth, but a myth that functioned like ancestry for thousands of years. According to Chinese legend, nearly every person of Han Chinese descent traces back to two legendary rulers, Wang Di, known as the Yellow Emperor, and Yan Di, the Flame Emperor, who are said to have lived around 4,600 years ago and either fought each other or joined forces, depending on which version of the story you were told as a child. For most of Chinese history, calling yourself a descendant of Yan Di and Huang Di wasn't just poetry. It was treated as a literal genealogical claim, the way some Western families used to insist they were descended from a specific medieval king. It gave an enormous, sprawling population spread across mountains, rivers, and coastlines, one shared origin point, one bloodline, one family tree with two roots at the very top. It's easy to understand why this story held on for so long. It's simple, it's proud, and it gives millions of people belonging to a single continuous story instead of feeling like scattered strangers who happen to end up on the same landmass. Even today, the phrase descendants of Yan Di and Huang Di shows up in speeches and textbooks and in ordinary conversation, not because anyone is running a genealogy chart in their head, but because it functions as a kind of shorthand for belonging, the same way people in other cultures might describe themselves as children of the soil or sons of the founding fathers, without meaning it as a literal biological claim. The story survived for 4,600 years, not because anyone could prove it, but because nobody had a way to disprove it either. It simply sat there, unquestioned, doing the emotional work that origin stories are built to do. The second story came from inside the world of science itself, or at least what passed for science in the early 20th century, and it's the one that got tangled up with real archaeology in a way that took decades to unravel. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, a French scholar named Terrien de Lacouperie put forward an idea that sounds almost unbelievable today, but was taken completely seriously by many Western academics at the time. He argued that Chinese civilization wasn't homegrown at all. He claimed that the legendary Yellow Emperor was actually a Mesopotamian ruler named Nekhunte, who supposedly led a group of Babylonian settlers on a long migration eastward, bringing writing, bronze working, and organized government with them into the Yellow River Valley. In other words, According to this theory, the entire foundation of Chinese civilization was really just an outpost of a much older Middle Eastern one planted on the other side of the continent. This idea was taken so seriously that it was debated in academic journals for years, and some Chinese reformers in the early 20th century even embraced parts of it, because at the time, tying Chinese civilization to the same ancient lineage as Mesopotamia and the biblical world felt like it gave China a seat at the table of what Western scholars considered the great ancient civilizations. It came from a real, understandable impulse, a desire to connect one's own history to the deepest, most celebrated root of civilization that Western academia recognized at the time. Part of what made this theory so persuasive to people at the time was that it wasn't built purely on wishful thinking. Its supporters pointed to real, surface-level similarities, things like shared symbols in early writing systems, comparable myths about floods and great rulers, and similar-sounding words scattered across ancient languages thousands of miles apart. To someone standing in the early 1900s without any way to test a bone or read a genome, those similarities looked like solid clues, breadcrumbs leading back to a single point of origin. It's only with the benefit of much more complete archaeology and eventually genetics that scholars were able to show those similarities were mostly coincidence, independent invention, or the kind of loose pattern matching that can connect almost any two ancient cultures if you squint hard enough. At the time, though, it felt like real evidence, and that's exactly why so many serious people signed on to it. The third story is the quietest one, but in some ways the most emotionally powerful because it isn't about a foreign origin at all, so it's about the opposite. Through much of the 20th century, a genuinely popular scientific idea held that the ancestors of modern Chinese people had been living in that same region of Asia for an almost unimaginably long time, stretching back not just thousands of years, but hundreds of thousands of years, directly descended from an ancient human ancestor known as Peking Man, whose fossils were discovered in a cave near Beijing in the 1920s. This idea, sometimes called regional continuity, suggested that different populations of ancient humans evolved somewhat separately in different parts of the world, each one gradually turning into the modern populations that live there today. Under this view, the people of East Asia weren't recent arrivals from anywhere. They were, in a sense, always there, the direct genetic heirs of ancient hominins who had walked the same ground for hundreds of thousands of years. For a long time, this wasn't a fringe belief. It was published, taught, and defended by serious scientists, and it's easy to see why it resonated so deeply. It offered an almost unbroken thread connecting the deep past directly to the present, without a single outside migration ever needed. There's also something worth noticing about why this particular theory felt so satisfying compared to the other two. It didn't require anyone to imagine a foreign founder or a legendary emperor arriving from somewhere else. It simply said, in effect, the people here have always been here, going back further than anyone could reasonably measure. For a region with one of the longest continuously written histories on the planet, an idea like that lines up almost too perfectly with how the culture already saw itself. A civilization that didn't need to borrow its origins from anywhere, because it had never really gone anywhere in the first place. So there they are, a divine dual bloodline running back to two legendary emperors, a foreign seed planted by Babylonian travelers, and an unbroken local thread running back hundreds of thousands of years to Peking Man. Three completely different pictures of the same people, each one believed with total sincerity by different generations, and each one impossible to fully test using old world tools like pottery styles, language comparisons, or ancient texts alone. Then geneticists opened up the genome. Once the scientists were able to sequence not just the DNA of living people, but the DNA preserved in ancient bones, this stopped being a debate about legends and started being a debate about evidence you could actually measure. Researchers studying ancient remains from sites across northern China, including a cave near Beijing that had preserved the bones of a man who lived roughly 40,000 years ago, were able to read long stretches of genetic code straight out of that ancient skeleton. Around the same world, teams working with East Asian genetic databases gathered DNA from tens of thousands of living people across China, comparing shared patterns passed down over thousands of generations. And in the wider field of ancient DNA research, scientists have spent the last 2 decades building a genetic map of ancient populations from Mesopotamia, Egypt, Europe, and the Americas, which finally made it possible to do something nobody could do before. Take DNA linked to real ancient civilizations from around the globe and directly compare it, piece by piece, against the deep ancestry of the people living in East Asia today. Before we get into what that comparison found, it helps to understand, in the simplest possible terms, what these scientists were actually reading. Every person's DNA is a long chain of chemical instructions, and small differences in that chain get passed down from parent to child, generation after generation, almost like a very long, very slowly changing family recipe. Most of that recipe is identical across every human being on the planet, no matter where their ancestors are from. In fact, when you compare any two random people anywhere in the world, the overwhelming majority of their DNA is exactly the same, and almost every meaningful difference between them comes down to them simply being different people, not different ethnic groups. The differences scientists care about for questions like this one are tiny, subtle patterns buried inside that shared recipe, patterns that tend to travel together in specific regions because people in the same area married, had children, and passed those patterns down together for thousands of years. When a population has been isolated in one place for a very long time, or has mixed with a very specific set of neighboring populations, those patterns leave a kind of fingerprint. That fingerprint is what researchers were comparing. Not something as simple or crude as skin color or facial features, but deep statistical patterns buried in thousands of tiny genetic markers. Patterns that can only be explained by tracing exactly which populations mixed with which other populations, and roughly when. To build a picture like this, researchers don't rely on a single sample or a single lucky discovery. They gather genetic material from dozens of ancient burial sites, sequence it using specialized laboratory techniques designed to work with damaged, degraded DNA that's been sitting in the ground for thousands of years, and then compare it statistically against both other ancient samples and large modern databases containing genetic information from tens of thousands of living volunteers across different regions. It's slow, careful, unglamorous work, closer to painstaking accounting than to the dramatic movie version of a lab discovery, but it's exactly that kind of patient, repeated comparison that lets scientists say with real confidence how one ancient population relates to another, rather than just guessing based on old maps and older assumptions. It also helps to understand just how difficult it actually is to pull usable DNA out of a bone that's been sitting in the ground for tens of thousands of years. Over that much time, DNA doesn't sit there perfectly preserved, waiting patiently to be read. It breaks down into tiny, damaged fragments, gets contaminated by bacteria and fungi that have been living in that same soil for just as long, and often ends up so degraded that, for decades, most scientists assumed genetic material that old simply couldn't be recovered at all. It took years of new laboratory methods, developed specifically for working with ancient, damaged samples, before researchers could reliably tell the difference between genuine ancient human DNA and the environmental contamination surrounding it, and before they could stitch together enough tiny broken fragments to reconstruct a usable picture of someone's ancestry. That difficulty is worth remembering because it's part of why this entire debate stayed unresolved for so long. It wasn't that scientists didn't want to test these old theories against real evidence. The technology capable of doing it responsibly simply didn't exist yet. Once the technology matured, though, it opened the door to a completely different scale of comparison than anything historians had ever been able to do with old texts and pottery styles alone. Instead of comparing a handful of written accounts or the shapes of ceramic pots found in different regions, researchers could now compare millions of individual genetic markers spread across an ancient genome against millions of the same markers in modern populations, and calculate, with real statistical confidence, how closely related two populations actually are and roughly how long ago their ancestors parted ways. That's a fundamentally different kind of evidence than anything available to the scholars who first proposed these theories 100 years ago, and it's exactly the kind of evidence needed to finally settle an argument that language and legend alone could never fully resolve. Before narrowing in on the three specific folk theories, it helps to understand just how wide this comparison actually was, because the phrase compared against every ancient civilization isn't just a dramatic way of putting it. Once large ancient DNA databases existed, researchers were genuinely able to place the deep ancestry of East Asian populations side by side with genetic material connected to ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, the early civilizations of the Indus Valley in South Asia, early farming populations in Europe, and even some of the earliest known populations in the Americas. Laid out that way, the differences are almost immediately obvious, even to someone with no scientific background at all. Populations connected to ancient Egypt carry a genetic signature shaped by tens of thousands of years of separate history along the Nile and across North Africa and the Near East. Populations connected to early Europe carry a signature shaped by a completely different set of ancient migrations, including several waves of herders and farmers moving across the European continent over thousands of years. None of those signatures line up with the deep ancestry found in East Asia. There's no meaningful genetic thread connecting the deep roots of Chinese populations to Egypt, to Mesopotamia, or to early Europe. No matter how tempting it might be to imagine one grand, interconnected ancient world, where every civilization secretly shares a common founding population. Each of these regions developed its own long, separate genetic history, shaped by its own migrations, its own environment, and its own timeline. What did line up, unmistakably, was the deep connection between the ancestry of people living in East Asia today and the ancient populations that lived in that same broad region tens of thousands of years ago, the ancestors of the farming communities along the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, and the early modern humans who had settled across East Asia not long after the larger out-of-Africa migration reached that part of the world. In the framing of the old debate, that's the one result that matched. And it's exactly the kind of finding that would have satisfied the regional continuity believers, at least on the surface. But as we're about to get into, satisfying one myth on the surface is not the same as confirming it completely. And the deeper researchers looked into that one match of the shared bloodline running back to Yandi and the shared bloodline running back to Yandi. This is the one that's the easiest to test using simple math. This is the one that's the easiest to test using simple math. Tell a very clear story. And then numbers. If the entire enormous population of Han Chinese people really did descend from just two individuals who lived around 4,600 years ago, who lived around 4,600 years ago, genetic fingerprint. You would expect to see a very specific population that exploded outward from a single population that exploded outward from a single tiny founding unmistakable signature behind something geneticists call severe genetic bottleneck. Geneticists call where everyone alive today would share an enormous, where everyone alive today would share an enormous, tightly clustered set of everyone in a massive city, almost like everyone in a massive city, cousins, all being unusually closely related. What shows up in the DNA. That is not remotely what shows up. The genetic diversity found across Chinese populations today, Chinese populations today, from many thousands exactly like what you would expect, spread across a huge and genetically diverse region, spread across a huge and genetically diverse region over tens of thousands of years, mixing and moving over tens of thousands of years, 4,500 years ago. Two individuals. Think of it like this: imagine an entire city of a million people. Imagine an entire city of a million people. Every single resident is descended from one married couple who moved in 5 generations ago. If that were true, everyone in that city would look eerily similar. Everyone in that city would look eerily similar, carried by that handful of rare medical conditions carried by that couple would show up constantly across the population. When you actually walk around that city, you find enormous variety around that city. Features. You find enormous variety medical history features. Clear evidence family medical history of different founding families. Clear evidence too. Thousands of different. That's exactly the mismatch scientists found. That's exactly the story of Yandi and Wang Di survives as a powerful piece of shared cultural identity. Survives as a powerful piece of shared cultural identity. Genetic origin point of over a billion people. It's also worth pointing out what the DNA suggests happened. It's also worth pointing out what the DNA suggests happened. Better story than the myth. Because it's arguably a better story rather than a single founding couple. The genetic record points to many thousands of genetic record points to many thousands scattered across river valleys, communities, coastlines, scattered across river valleys, coastlines, and mountain regions, gradually growing, what is now China, trading, gradually growing with each other over tens of thousands of years. With each other over tens of thousands of years. Were farming millet in the north. Those communities were farming rice millet in the north. Others were farming rice in the agricultural tradition that developed separate agricultural tradition over thousands of years. These separate populations gradually merged. These separate populations gradually merged, not through one dramatic founding event, but through one dramatic constant process that looked less like a single family tree and more like dozens of smaller trees, gradually dozens of smaller very large river, gradually joining into one very large river. Unglamorous as it sounds compared to two legendary emperors, as it sounds compared to what genetics actually shows sitting underneath is what genetics actually shows sitting underneath the myth. The idea that Chinese civilization was really led by a ruler named the Yellow Emperor. Led by a ruler. This one falls apart even faster. Once you compare ancient DNA directly, once you compare ancient DNA studies of populations, ancient DNA studies of populations connected to Mesopotamia, show a genetic profile that is clearly rooted in populations from that region, that is clearly rooted in nearby areas from the Caucasus and the Fertile Crescent, nearby areas of the Caucasus, tens of thousands of years of separate history, by tens of thousands of years of separate history. DNA from early populations, ancient East DNA from early populations shows East Asia, on the other hand, stretching back deep tens of thousands of years in that region, stretching back tens of thousands of years in that region had built the first long before anyone in Mesopotamia. If a wave of Babylonian settlers really had swept in, if a wave of Babylonian Chinese settlers really had swept in a few thousand years ago, that migration would leave behind a distinct, that migration would leave behind a distinct, a clear injection of West Asian ancestry sitting right on top, similar to how you can still detect European ancestry, how you can still detect European ancestry centuries after colonization began. Centuries after that injection simply does not exist in the genetic record. That injection simply does not exist in the genetic record. West Asian or Mesopotamian ancestry West Asian on top of ancient ancestry Asian population on top of ancient. At the time Chinese civilization was forming. At the time Chinese civilization was pouring a single cup of red dye into an enormous single cup of red dye into an enormous swimming pool. You would still be able to detect that dye today. You would still be able to detect that dye today. Geneticists look for that tint specifically. Geneticists simply isn't there. Tint specifically. The theory made sense to scholars working only with old similarities between early writing systems, surface level similarities. But once real biological evidence entered the picture, there's also a simple timing problem that makes the theory even harder to defend once you line up the archaeology properly. Organized farming communities, early bronze working, and the first stirrings of complex society were already developing along the Yellow River well before the timeline the Babylonian migration theory requires, meaning the region wasn't sitting empty, waiting for outside settlers to arrive and jumpstart civilization. It already had deep roots of its own, growing on its own timeline, shaped by its own environment, long before anyone from the ancient Near East could plausibly have made the journey. The theory wasn't just missing supporting evidence. It was actively contradicted by evidence that was sitting in the ground the whole time, waiting for archaeologists to dig it up properly and date it correctly. That leaves the third theory, the one about unbroken descent from Peking man, stretching back hundreds of thousands without any outside migration at all. And this is where the story gets genuinely more complicated because this theory doesn't fail completely. It fails in a very specific and revealing way. When scientists compared ancient DNA from early modern humans in East Asia against the small number of ancient fossils and any traces of genetic material connected to far older human relatives like Peking man, they find something clear. The overwhelming majority of ancestry Asian populations today traces back to modern humans who expanded out of Africa, spread across Asia roughly 50 to 60,000 years ago, part of the same broad wave of migration that populated Europe, Australia, and the Americas. In other words, the deep, unbroken hundreds of thousands of years thread from Peking man directly into modern populations with no outside migration at all isn't what the genetic evidence shows. Almost everyone living in East Asia today, just like everyone living everywhere else outside of Africa, carries the genetic fingerprint of that relatively recent expansion. Imagine a house that's been standing in the same spot for 100 years, and someone claims every board in the walls today is literally the original 100-year-old wood. When you actually inspect the house, you find the foundation is genuinely old, but the walls, the roof, and almost everything you can see and touch was rebuilt using much newer material a few tens of thousands of years ago. Material that arrived from somewhere else, completely replaced what came before. So the myth of total unbroken local continuity for hundreds of thousands of years with zero outside migration also doesn't hold up as a complete picture, at least not in the simple form it was once taught. This is also where it becomes to slow down and be precise, because it would be easy to overcorrect, say the regional continuity idea was completely wrong top to bottom. That's not quite fair either. The people who believed in an unbroken local thread going back hundreds of years were reacting to something real. They're genuinely much older human relatives living in that same region for an extremely long time before modern humans ever arrived. The mistake wasn't in sensing that ancient connection to the land. The mistake was in assuming that connection ran in one continuous unbroken genetic line all the way to the present, rather than being mostly replaced several tens of thousands of years ago by a new arriving population that then stayed became the ancestors of nearly everyone living in the region today. The land holds a genuinely ancient story. It just isn't quite the story people originally told about it. And this is exactly where the pivot happens. Because if none of the stories survive fully intact, you'd expect the real answer to just be the boring, obvious one. Recent migration out of Africa, like everywhere else. End of story. But that's not what happened. This is where the video stops being about debunking old myths and starts being about something researchers themselves didn't fully expect to find, sitting underneath the wreckage of three theories. When scientists sequenced the genome of that ancient man from near Beijing, the one who lived around 40,000 years ago, they found his DNA does share a deep connection with people living in East Asia today. Exactly the kind of local continuity that believers had always sensed was there, just not on the timescale they imagined. His ancestry lines up with the early branch of modern humans who had already settled in East Asia long after arriving out of African migration. So there really is a genuine ancient local root in East Asia, tens of thousands of years deep, just not hundreds of thousands of years deep, and not without that original outside arrival first. That alone would already be an interesting resolution to a century-old argument. But it's not the twist. The twist is what showed up when scientists looked even more closely at that same genetic material and started comparing not just to modern East Asian populations, but to ancient populations on the completely opposite side of the world.